The aftermath of the Second Great War left the once guiding force of the globe, the European powers, in shambles. Succeeding them came the new powers of the United States and Soviet Union. The Cold War which followed saw lines drawn and sides taken in a battle of arms, advancement, conquest, and capability. The powers of Europe, though hesitant to surrender their reins to American dominance, found themselves with only a bleak alternative as it appeared the Soviets held ambitions of further expansion westward. The US took to rebuilding the Western Bloc, and so its members found themselves bent to American interests for the remainder of the ideological conflict. Part of this arrangement was the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka the North Atlantic Alliance, or NATO, a protective military pact for collective defense in which an attack upon even the group's smallest member would constitute an attack on all, and in this case most especially the United States. Being an ocean away and hardly at direct threat of Soviet forces marching upon the capital, the US at the time was a difficult force to provoke and historically upheld a policy of isolation to its own hemisphere. However, for several reasons, most notably preventing the spread of communism at a time when seemingly no one else could, the US took to adopting this role hoisted upon it, although it could have had just as much justification for removing itself entirely, and in this alternate timeline, that's exactly what happens. With the war over and borders firmly established with the Soviets, the US moves to return to its own domestic affairs even despite the potential threats posed by the Soviets. An outcome like this could have been the product of Senator Robert Alphonso Taft, son of former President William Taft, coming to greater prominence in the US during the final years of the war. Taft had been a hardline, outspoken isolationist who feared prolonged American intervention overseas and increased commitments to foreign powers would prove disastrous for not only American liberties and sense of personal destiny, but those of its allies whose interests would come second to those of the US, while their troubles took focus over those of the domestic American. Taft had even been a contender for the Republican nomination, a few times actually, repeatedly being beat out due to his non-interventionist stance during the war, and it was in the post-war period that he may have finally won, that is until General Dwight Eisenhower, fearful of his isolationist rhetoric, chose to campaign against him with both the support of the internationalist faction and his military prestige, both eventually assuring him the victory. This time, things are different. Not only is NATO abandoned, but thanks to Taft's greater success early on, so are the Marshall Plan and further European aid programs. The Chinese Communists still drive the nationalists off the mainland, bringing Taiwan under the American Pacific Protection sphere, along with Japan and South Korea. The Korean War still occurs, but its tremendous lack of popularity throws only greater support behind Taft for his campaign. Israel would still be recognized by the US in this timeline, however with the Soviet Union's earlier recognition of the region, and soon to come American isolation, it's quite possible that in this world it may shift closer to the other side of the conflict, at least until the Soviets are forced to choose between it and the Arab nations. In Europe, though NATO is done away with, the Western Union Defense Organization survives and maintains a defensive bloc against Soviet aggression. British researchers who had contributed to the American nuclear program would coordinate with French physicists to produce their own atomic weapons, all as the reconstruction process continued. The prospect of a Franco-British Union is proposed to strengthen their mutual economies, but this is foregone in favor of simply including Britain in the European coal and steel community. Britain, holding the greatest remaining power in the community, would come to dominate it and shape it into a tighter union, essentially managing the industries and resources of other nations for their collective benefit. This nationalization was commonplace for the post-war British government, and though it would be unpopular for the other member states, would serve to maximize their production and utilization of resources. Efforts toward establishing a joint European military now become a major focus for this union, as without the United States, so goes a majority of what would have been and remained the region's primary defenses. This would likely entail the rebuilding of the German army as an anti-Soviet buffer, as had been proposed by Churchill and American General Patton. Without American support, Western Germany also faces greater challenges in restoring itself to pre-war living standards, something which may also contribute to British domination of the Union, and a now British plan for German reconstruction. With the American promise of defense broken, so would the British promises of the Atlantic Charter be rejected as plainly impractical for the situation it now found itself in. This meant a harder stance against trade and cooperation with America and internationally with other UN countries. It also meant a return to British, or rather now European, claim to the Atlantic, and a maintaining of colonial possessions including spoils of war. However, with borders already drawn, the spoils point may not have much impact unless Britain suddenly decides to claim a portion of the German coast for itself, but that's not to be expected. Despite this stance on maintaining colonialism, India still manages to achieve independence early on. However, later independence movements, most especially in Africa, turn up unsuccessful. The uprising in Vietnam and the rest of Indochina also drives French forces out, leading to a greater focus on protecting Dutch Indonesia from the spread of communism, and a larger military presence on the islands provided by France, the Netherlands, and Australia. In absence of the US to intervene, Greece and Turkey felt Soviet influence early on, with Italy, Iran, the Arab world, and swaths of Latin America coming to align closer with the USSR following the ascension of socialist and pro-communist parties in these respective countries. Alone, Britain isn't able to intervene in Iran, though Italy is able to be made a neutral non-aligned power like Yugoslavia, eventually finding itself excluded from the Western Union and brought closer to its non-aligned neighbor. The Soviets soon find themselves forced to choose between either Israel or the Arabs, and eventually find themselves aligned with the latter, based on Stalin's fears that Eastern European Jews in the USSR and Western Bloc had personal bias toward Israel, and thus posed a threat to the Soviet Union. Israel would thus turn to the Western Bloc for support as it came under attack from all sides. The US, with its focus geared solely upon the Western Hemisphere, is able to pacify all communist and socialist movements within Latin America via an earlier and wider implementation of Operation Condor. Taking a hardline stance against communist ideology in the Americas through a reinforcing of the Monroe Doctrine, additionally extending to the deterring of European influence following increased estrangement between the two sides of the West, in a series of events mirroring the Sino-Soviet split, particularly adopting stricter relations with Canada and Brazil to either join their American brother states or expect to be treated with no more special privilege than a European nation. Eventually, ideological splits also occurred between the Soviets, Chinese, and Islamic spheres, each carrying forward their own brands of socialism. Italy and Yugoslavia remained socialist-leaning but maintained non-alignment. Africa would see the beginnings of greater zones of organization and development to help establish it as a long-term asset for the West against the Soviet Union. With the Middle East now estranged from the USSR and without the US to take action, Britain, France, and Israel all mutually cooperate to overthrow the United Arab Republic, bringing Egypt and Libya back under colonial rule. The West, despite being forced to fend for itself against the threat posed by the Soviets, manages to catch up to a formidable level once again thanks to the resources drawn upon from its colonies and freedom from American oversight. The removal of Cuba from the equation as well would contribute to an overall weakening of major communist insurgencies within Africa, as the Cubans had been a significant factor in the training and arming of said rebels. However, with greater communist pull in the Middle East, it's likely this would form an opening for weapon supplies from the USSR and its allies to Sudan and Ethiopia, which would have come under colonial occupation and be prime zones for proxy conflicts between the East and West. The Far East and Pacific Ocean would be a domain of tension between all global parties, the US and West each holding territories in the region, which would regularly require securing from not only China but each other as well. This alternate Europe would not quite go the route of the EU as we know it today, but rather pursue an alliance akin to those envisioned by the powers of the Old Order. A more imperial union with Britain at the helm. It'd be one which would see Germany kept under tight British control to prevent its ambitious and capable rival from rising again. One which would serve as the basis for the old empires of Europe to finally recover and regain their positions in the world, of course with Germany excluded. In our world, Europe had and continues to have the tremendous benefit of American-provided defense via NATO, contributing a whopping 70.5% of the alliance's total assets. This in part has played a large role in allowing the European powers to focus internally and develop the EU into the economic and global powerhouse it is today, as well as why concepts like a united European military have been forestalled in favor of increased cooperation in other fields. In absence of American support and faced with the immediate Soviet threat, the European powers of the West would need to coordinate as a single force, even at the cost of safer and less extreme processes. Left to its own devices, this union still could find itself tremendously outmatched by the Soviets and would be forced to maintain the assets of its colonial empire, even despite calls for decolonization by what came to be a growing movement for so-called global peace and freedoms, which itself had stemmed from the US from as early as the establishment of the League of Nations following the First Great War. And in this world, as before, it would gradually fall apart due in portion to a lack of America's own investment, and thus the international order would return to the historic status quo. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Check out our novel, I Am Uncle Sam, in the links below. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.